I learned that there was such a thing as a wine economist from a famous winemaker. My wife, Sue, and I were newlyweds, and it was so long ago that people without a lot of money could take a budget vacation in Napa Valley. On the way back in the last day, we were driving up the Colorado Trail, and I saw this name. If I knew more about wines then, that I would have recognized that it was the name of a winery that was kind of famous for that Judgment of Paris that had gone on before. So we pulled in for one last tasting, and he pulled out the corks and poured the bottles, and we began to talk. He learned that I was an economist. Suddenly, he began to ask me very serious questions. He wanted to know about inflation rates because they were moving up and interest rates. And it really made a difference to him because his business involved a lot of capital investment, involved a lot of time for the vineyards, for the aging. He really wanted to know when these wines were ready, would consumers be there, be a good situation to sell them.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 64. You're in for a special treat today in this conversation with Mike Veseth, known as the Wine Economist, an award-winning author and professor emeritus in Washington. He took an around-the-world trip in 80 wines, Jules Verne style, to discover great value wines and the stories behind them. Now, this conversation first aired on my regular Facebook Live video show, so you'll often hear me responding to a comment that one of the viewers has made. You can join in that conversation every second Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. If you're listening to this podcast on the day it's published, our next Facebook chat will be next week. Mark it on your calendar. I'll put a link in the show notes where you can find us next Wednesday, as well as to Mike's website, books, social media handles, and the video version of this conversation at nataliemclain.com/64. So why not make 2020 the year that you move from feeling overwhelmed with all the wines in the liquor store to feeling confident about every wine you buy and knowing exactly which dish will pair perfectly with it? I can help. Sign up for my free online video wine class, The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever. Go to nataliemclain.com/class and choose a time and date that work for you. I look forward to seeing you there. Okay, on with the show. Does price affect your perception of a wine's quality? What would it be like to travel around the world in pursuit of 80 wines? That's exactly what we're going to learn from our guest who joins me live from Washington. Our guest writes about the fascinating intersection of money, taste, and wine. He has published more than a dozen books that have won numerous awards, including The Wine Wars, Extreme Wine, Money, Taste, and Wine, It's Complicated, and his latest book, Around the World in 80 Wines. He is a professor emeritus of the University of Tacoma at Puget Sound in Washington, where he taught international political economy, and prior to that, he earned his PhD in economics from Purdue University. Today, he's known as the Wine Economist, and he joins me now from Washington. Welcome, Mike Veseth, the Wine Economist. Good to have you here, Mike. I mean, you have such an impressive background. I've only hit the highlights. Fill in the gaps and tell us maybe something that would surprise people about you, maybe that they wouldn't know about you.
Well, I have a double identity. I'm really confused. I lead a double life. If you go on to Amazon or Google and you search for Michael Veseth, which is the name my mother gave me, well, then you get the professor, the serious professor, the guy who writes books about globalization and a series of university textbooks and so forth. And then if you go to those same places and you look for Mike Veseth, then you get me, the wine economist, the person that writes about wine. And the difference, the split, the personality split, was actually very intentional. That when I started to get into writing about wine, I didn't want to write just for professors. There are a lot of academic wine economists. There's a European Wine Economists Association, an American Wine Economist, and I didn't want to write just for them. I wanted to write for people in the industry, for consumers, to get lots of feedback. And through a little testing, we discovered that Michael Veseth didn't get a lot of replies and comments. People were a little intimidated by their professor. But Mike Veseth, oh yeah. So here I am.
Well, Mike, I'm glad you joined us, and Michael has retired for the evening. That's excellent. So please tell us, the Wine Economist, how did you get that title?
Well, I learned that there was such a thing as a wine economist from a famous winemaker. It was a while ago when my wife Sue and I were newlyweds, and it was so long ago that people without a lot of money could take a budget vacation in Napa Valley. So that's what we were doing. We drove down from Washington State to California, and we were staying in a budget hotel and not spending a lot of money, trying not to spend a lot of money. And on the way back in the last day, we were driving up the Silverado Trail, and I saw this name. If I knew more about wines then, that I would have recognized that it was the name of a winery that was kind of famous for that Judgment of Paris that had gone on before.
Right.
But I didn't know that, so we pulled in for one last tasting and walked through the big redwood doors, and there was a cellarette, and the winemaker was there. If I'd known more about wine, I would have known that he was pretty famous, but I didn't know, so I just, he pulled out the corks and poured the bottles, and we began to talk, and I was sitting there at the end of a long day of wine tasting and was having trouble swirling without spilling. So I was working on that, asking these simple questions. And he learned that I was an economist. And suddenly, he began to ask me very serious questions. He wanted to know about inflation rates because they were moving up, and interest rates because they were 18, 20, 25, 30%, and so forth. And it really made a difference to him because his business involved a lot of capital investment, involved a lot of time for the vineyards, time for the barrel aging. He really wanted to know that when these wines were ready, would the economy be there? Would consumers be there? Would be a good situation to sell it? What was happening in the economy, the part that I knew about, would affect whether his wines, what he could do in terms of making an investment in barrel aging and so forth, or what he might have to do. And when I got back to our budget hotel in Santa Rosa that night, I sat down and said, wow, I think I just learned something. I learned that there is wine economics, that the wine is an art and a craft and a science, but it's also a business.
Absolutely, Mike. And, I would just say, given that vines on average take 7 years to mature, if not longer, people in the wine business have to plan really for the long term. We're talking 7 years out. It's not like this year's sneaker style. It's like decisions you make today will affect your bottom line 7, 10, 15, 20 years from now. I don't know if you found this in your travels, but I think that's often why family businesses do well in the wine industry. I know there's been a lot of corporate takeovers and so on and consolidation, but still, families who look to that long term, the economics, I think, work in their favor if they're always looking at that long-term vision.
No, it's exactly right. In fact, one of the chapters in Around the World in 80 Wines, the chapter on Australia, talks about the unexpected importance of family businesses and some of the reasons why that might be the case. So I think you're exactly right. When you look at other industries of the same size, other global industries, they're not as dominated by family businesses as the wine industry is, that's for sure.
Wow, this is the most fun kind of economics I've ever encountered.
Economics with a glass of wine. So
exactly. I love that. I did an MBA, but it was like economics was never this fun, Mike. Okay, so let's do a little bit of background storytelling before we dive into your books, your fantastic books with the best titles ever that I've heard of. Let's start with maybe take us to the worst moment of your wine career. Let's start there and then we'll go low, then we'll go high.
Yeah. Start at the bottom, huh? Well,
exactly.
I am fortunate. I haven't had any tragedies. I'm not a winemaker, so I haven't lost a vintage or had something terrible like that happen. I think maybe the worst personal moment was both embarrassing and painful. It was a couple of years ago, and a local group of amateur winemakers decided that they would host a charity event to raise money for charity. And they asked me if I would be a wine judge. And I'm not a professional taster like you. I mean, they should have asked you, but instead they asked me. So it was great. It was an amateur judge and amateur winemakers. And our team of judges, we tasted everything blind and went back and tasted some more. And when we announced the winner, for example, the wine we chose as the best, this was the embarrassing part, the best white wine wasn't even made out of grapes.
Oh.
It was made out of figs.
Of what?
Figs.
Figs.
F-I-G-S. Yeah.
No.
It tasted like a Malvasia or Steinway. It was head and shoulders better than the other wines, but people looked at us like we didn't really know what we were doing.
I can imagine.
But not painful. The painful part came that night when all of us judges got horribly sick. None of those amateur winemaking wine must have had a bacterial problem. And so we all got food poisoning, and you know how you spend the night with food poisoning.
Yeah, that's no fun.
The worst moment.
Wow, that's pretty low. That's pretty low. Oh my gosh. Judging a homemade wine competition. You are a brave man.
I didn't know I was brave then.
Okay.
Anyway.
So let's go high now. What has been the highlight of your wine career so far?
I've had a lot of great moments. Interesting, a book reviewer once started a review that says, everyone should be as lucky as Mike Veseth.
Nice. Why did he say that?
Because I'm happy with what I'm doing. And this is
very nice. That's lovely.
My best moment, I think, was back in 2013. And I was invited to South Africa to give the speech at something called the Netterberg auction.
Okay.
The Netterberg auction, Netterberg is a winery in Stellenbosch. They have an auction once a year, and they choose older vintages from the best of the South African wineries. So people come in, and the idea is that most people never have a chance to taste an older vintage. So they curate these things and auction them off to retailers and distributors and so forth from around the world. And so it gets the best of South African wine out where people can taste it and appreciate it. And every year they have one speech. And so I got to give the speech. And
nice.
It was interesting because I was so darn nervous. Trying to learn everything I could about South Africa and its wine. I got to the end of the speech, according to Wine Enthusiast, which sent a reporter to cover it. It said that the people stood up and cheered.
Oh, isn't that great?
And I think the thing they loved is that I wasn't telling them, this is what you need to do to be so. That at the end of it, I suggested to them that their wines were great. And they were really great. And they are. And that what they needed to do to try to draw in the rest of the world for their wines is to do what they do best, which is something called a braai.
That's a South African. Is it a barbecue or
barbecue? Yeah.
Okay.
It is the uniting force in South Africa that black and white and Indian and indigenous and everybody in South Africa gets together to enjoy a braai. Their national day of unity is actually called Braai Day. I think the idea that I would be saying that the thing that brings you together is the thing that can help propel you. Because there are braais that go with white wines and braais that go with red wines. Everyone likes a barbecue or a braai. So it was a moving moment. I was really moved by it.
That is, yeah, you remember that. You remember the things that touch you deeply, that you feel deeply. Braai also reminds me of the Argentine equivalent of asado.
That's
I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but yeah, very cool. So, Mike, let's go now to perhaps the most memorable thing someone has said about your writing. You've said something already that was really interesting, but is there anything else you wanted to add to that? Because I know you've won lots of awards.
Once again, it's a moving thing. There's a winemaker in the south of France named Caro Feely. She runs a wine school and she writes books about her experiences. Her newest one is called A Glass Half Full. She, a few years ago, asked me to write a book blurb for one of her books, a little endorsement on the back of the cover. So I asked her to write one for Money, Taste, and Wine. It's complicated. So she sent me the blurb, and in the blurb, she said that she laughed out loud at some of the things I said. And that's
always good.
But then in the text of the email that went along with it, she said it also made her cry.
Oh.
And it made her cry because although she's living in France, she's originally, it's a South Africa connection, she's originally from the Klein Karoo, this wonderful kind of remote area of South Africa. And in fact, Money, Taste, and Wine ends in the Klein Karoo, with Sue and I in the back of a pickup truck going to a braai with the stars above us and everything.
Oh.
And she said that my description of that journey at the end of the book made her so homesick that she cried. And of course, that touches me, because to think that I might be able to connect with someone that way, that closely is very sad.
You've already painted a picture too, in the back of a pickup truck and the stars and everything else. It's being there. It's taking us there with that imagery. That's just lovely. Let's chat about your books. Would you like to start with your most recent one, Mike?
Oh, sure. So this is Around the World, 80 Wines.
80 Wines. Excellent. So we know Around the World in 80 Days, classic book. So what is your take on this? What's the concept? What's the organizing principle, if you will?
For the longest time, I have been fascinated by books that take the reader on a journey. Although the idea of this is that you're following the author through this and discovering something about the world. It seems to me that you're always really interested in finding out something about yourself. I've got Around the World in 80 Days and Gulliver's Travels and Jonathan Rabin's Old Glory and Mark Twain's travel books. They're all around here. I'm just fascinated. And at one point, I began to realize that Sue and I were on a journey of our own too. And we were discovering things about the wine world and things about. So I'm fascinated, inspired by Jules Verne. I decided to take his journey and to see to what extent the journey that we've been taking mapped up on it. So that, for example, his journey begins in London at a place called the Reform Club.
Huh.
So our journey begins in London, 3 blocks away, at a wine shop called Berry Brothers and Rudd.
Oh, that's famous in London. Yeah.
Selling wine for 400 years and so forth. And so that's the start and the end point. And it follows Phileas Fogg, the Jules Verne hero, through France and Italy. But then life gets complicated. Phileas Fogg has to get as fast as he can around the world. And I'm more interested in accumulating stories. And this is maybe the big difference, is that Around the World in 80 Days was designed to be this story of man and technology versus nature and distance. And the idea that someone could overcome the challenges of moving quickly around the world, the technological. For me, it made me sort of stop and think, what is it I'm trying to find out about wine in the world? And I ended up on the question of why wine? Why is wine so important? Why does wine motivate and excite and inspire people around the world? Mm-hmm. So doing this, I don't have to cover distance. I have to accumulate stories that reveal some truth about the importance and significance of wine and the people, to their communities, to their families, to the world.
Oh, I love the concept. I love that, following the footsteps of a classic journey, a classic novel. It's fantastic. What a great organizing principle, because you do need that to hold together the narrative. How long did it take you to write this book?
It took a little over a year to actually get the writing of the book done. But part of that is that as we travel, I record a lot of my thoughts and so forth on my blog, The Wine Economist. It's at wineeconomist.com. The Wine Economist started off as a way for me to have this exchange with people so that I could try out ideas instead of trying out ideas in academic papers, trying out ideas out in the open so that people could criticize them, make suggestions and so forth. So a lot of the writing of the ideas had been developed. And then it's a matter of sitting down and that painful process of actually getting words on a screen.
Yes, absolutely. So you treated your blog or your website, thewineeconomist.com, almost like a peer review site, the way academics would contribute and say, okay, you need to look at this, refine this question is unanswered. That's fantastic that you...
It works really well because if I've got a good idea, I learn about it. If I've got an okay idea, people improvement. If, as often happens, I have a terrible idea, I find out about that pretty fast, too.
Very quickly, yes. As do I. I have a group that I call Wine Lovers for Better Grammar, and they will tell me every time I've got a dangling participle or a comma misplaced. There's a raging debate about the Oxford comma. Anyway, that's going down a rabbit hole. How would you describe a value wine, Mike?
Oh, well, I have a colleague, Pierre Lee. He's French. And when he and his wife, Cynthia Housen, go wine tasting at events with me, here's what they do. They go around and then they taste the wine and they don't write down 89 points, or they write down how much they would be willing to pay for it.
I love that.
And then they look to see, and if the price is less than what they had thought they'd be willing to pay. So I call it the Is It Worth It Index.
I love that. That's brilliant. Awesome. I'm going to do that from now on. How much would I pay for this? Excellent. Oh.
There are some times when, even though the price is very high, you taste that wine and think, wow, this is priceless.
Exactly. And people are always looking for that. They do the QPR, the quality price ratio. And there was even a site, I don't know if it still exists, that does that. For quality, they take the score, which is an approximation, and relate it to the price. But I love that concept of how much would I pay for this?
Yeah.
I love that. I love it. Where would you point us to as a wine economist for the best wine values these days?
Okay. So there are great wine values from a lot of places. It's a matter of searching them out and increasingly looking where you're not expecting them. Wines from Chile, for example, red wines from Chile, have a reputation for very good value. I talk about it in the book. It's almost a curse because they would like to be known, the Chileans, they'd like it to be known for great wines and great values. People tend to think of them as great values. Mm-hmm. With the South African wines, there's not that many in the market. Some of them are sort of stunningly delicious for the price that you would pay.
Absolutely. I've come across some recently, Mike, that taste almost like a Bordeaux. And I've been recommending them. They're like $25 and they taste like even a second, third growth Bordeaux. It's like, wow. And many of them have had their tutelage in Bordeaux. It's unbelievable, the value coming out of there and the refinement. And yet it's a South African signature that's on right. The wine.
And let me put in a plug for Washington State wines.
Yes, please.
Yeah, because Washington State, there is a reason why California wineries are now investing more in Washington, because they can make wines that will remind you of a Napa Valley wine, but at half or a third of the price.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So, Mike, let's get back to your books. Is there anything else you want to tell us about Around the World in 80 Wines? It's your newest book. We can talk about some of your other books, but is there something else you want to say about that one before we sort of talk about the other ones?
Well, it's just that it, for me, is an account of what is really quite it seems to me, a fascinating journey and an opportunity to think about all the different ways that wines affect people and affect the world all around the world. And I will say that this is a teaser for your viewers here, that in Around the World in 80 Days, Jules Verne has a surprise ending twist because he arrives in London and he thinks he's lost. Only to discover that through some twist of fate, he has not lost at all. And so inspired by that, Around the World in 80 Wines also has a surprise twist, which I provided not only to imitate Jules Verne, but also to make it possible for every reader, no matter what their wine taste would be, to come away satisfied with the conclusion. So
I love that.
You read the book, take a look, wait for it, as they say.
So to begin again at the beginning and to know that place for the first time, that's Lord Alfred Tennyson. But, to journey through our senses, through the world of wine, this sounds like this is your book. And then to come back again, more knowledgeable, and yet to know that sensory experience for the first time. I need to dig into that. Oh, my goodness.
In Around the World for 80 Wines, I talk about Beaujolais and Nouveau. And I call Nouveau a Black Friday wine.
Why Black Friday? Because it's a discounted?
I think it's in Canada too. Black Friday is the day that if a retailer can sell enough, they'll be in the black for the whole year.
It's true.
If they can't sell enough, well, they're going to go be in the red. And for the longest time, Beaujolais Nouveau was that Black Friday wine. At one point, more than half of all Beaujolais wines were Nouveau.
Oh.
And if they could sell all of those, and often they sold them at a higher price than the Cru Beaujolais wines.
Oh, wow.
Sell all of those, they'd be in the black for the whole year.
It's definitely a cash flow crop.
Yeah, that's Chateau cash flow. Exactly, yeah.
Ah, I like that. So some of your books, well, all of them actually, have intriguing titles. Money, Taste, and Wine. It's complicated. What was the concept of that one versus Around the World? This
began with the idea that an economist might be able to talk a little bit to consumers about how an economist would buy wine if an economist thought about it a little bit. And so, for example, the very first chapter is called The Wine Drinker's Biggest Mistake.
Ah.
You know what that is.
Tell us.
It's mistaking price and quality.
Ah, okay. All right. There you go.
And so I talk a little bit in here about some of the research about how that's the case and why that's the case and how it can lead to all sorts of errors. I point out that I have friends that when they go to the supermarket to buy wine, what they look for are what are called shelf talkers.
Those slips with the points on them.
That's it. And sometimes they have points, but I have friends that what they look for is the biggest markdown. $20, but you pay only $12 or something like that. And so that they look at the top number and they say, wow, that must be a really good wine. And then look at the bottom number and they say, okay. If you found a car like that, if you were looking for a used car and it said regularly $20,000, but for you only $12,000, you would say, what's wrong with it?
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
But I have friends that when they see that, it's like a trout going after a lure, and they just stop themselves from doing that. And part of it, maybe the price informs them on what to expect. And
yes.
Some of the research suggests is that when you see a price, that your brain, first of all, is always way too busy. You're always multitasking in that. It's always looking for shortcuts. And so when it sees a price, then it knows that the higher price ought to be justified by higher quality, so that it begins to program in an expectation of higher quality. And when they did these awful, I say awful only because I would hate to be one, these awful MRI studies where they put consumers in an MRI and they put a tube in their mouth and feed them wine and they tell them stuff.
Yes.
When they told them that they took the same wine, and when they told them it was like a $12 wine, the little part of the brain that shows happiness glowed a little bit. But then a little later, when they told them it was a $100 wine, same wine, it's like they not only thought they were happy, but they were actually happy.
Actually were, at least chemically.
Turns out money does actually buy happiness in a very limited sense.
So why do we fall for this sale deal thing in wine and not on cars? Why don't we look at the wine that's on sale and go, what's wrong with that wine? Or do we?
Well, I think there are consumers that respond in different ways to all of this. For example, I think part of it is that in many other things that we buy, we have experience with them, or we know about them. But in a supermarket, there are 2,000 different wines, and you don't really know what's in that bottle. Or even if it's sometimes if it's a fine wine, you don't really know that vintage very well. And so you're working in the dark more than you are in a lot of other consumer goods. And so that means that all of this little bit of information is very influential.
Yeah, that's true.
But you've got to then overcome this idea that price is giving you more information than it really is.
That's great. I always say there's a reason we don't have orange juice critics, right?
That's right. Or, in the supermarkets around here, they'll often have a clerk that lurks around to help people make decisions, a wine steward.
Yeah.
Something. I point out that they don't actually have milk stewards to help you.
No, exactly. There's no one saying, buy that cabbage versus that one.
That's it.
You'll be fine.
Okay. So Money, Taste, and Wine started off as this, and it talks about to help people, guide people through how to think about buying wine in a restaurant or whether to invest in wine and so forth. And then in the later chapters, it's begin to think of all the different places where money and taste are involved, and wine, taste, and wine were involved. Then you add money to it, and it changes it. So
money changes everything. All right. So let us turn now. I can't believe how fast this has gone, which is a testament to how interesting you are, Mike. What I'm calling the lightning round.
Okay.
All right. So these are a series of quick questions and short answers because we just love getting tips and advice as we come to the finish line here. So what is the best piece of wine advice you've ever received, Mike?
Oh, know thyself, trust thyself.
Okay. What's the one thing you were wrong about, perhaps, as it relates to wine?
I've been wrong about a lot of things. But one thing that I think I was wrong about that a lot of other people were is cork closures. I think a dozen years ago, I kind of wrote off cork and I thought, well, screw caps are getting better and synthetics and so forth. But the amount of research and change that there has been done in order to improve cork closures now, they've even got something called a helix, a screw cork. You seen this?
No, I haven't. Yeah, okay.
Google helix cork. And so it solves even that last problem. Now, cork taint, even in less expensive corks, is virtually eliminated in the world. And so cork is back. And because it's a natural product, I'm glad that it's back. I have nothing against the other things. But so I wrote off cork without appreciating how much the cork producers would invest to resolve their errors and how much people love cork.
I'm glad to hear that. I need to re-examine my own misperceptions or hangover perceptions of cork. Thank you for that. What's the most useful wine gadget you've ever come across?
I'm not a big fan of gadgets.
No?
For me, corkscrew is but if, a friend of mine earlier this year showed me some gizmo where you take a wine bottle and you put a thing in it and you put a carafe upside down and you flip it over.
Oh.
And it gurgles.
Yeah.
And you put it back over, and so the aerated wine goes back in the original bottle. It wasn't very expensive, and I could taste the difference. So cool. I've got a gadget.
Okay, that's good. If you could share a bottle of wine with any person outside of the wine world, living or dead, who would that be?
Outside of the wine world? Oh, maybe Mark Twain, because he traveled to some of these places, or Jules Verne.
Oh, Jules Verne, yes.
I think that would be it, yeah.
Excellent. If you could put up a billboard in downtown Toronto or Seattle, wherever, what would it say?
Oh, well, if it's in Toronto, it's easy.
Okay.
VQA wines.
All right.
So many great VQA wines in Ontario, and I'd love to see that industry explode.
Fantastic. And finally, what's the most interesting question you've ever been asked? Because I'm collecting them.
Oh, the most interesting question I've ever been asked. I guess it must be this one because it's a hard.
Okay, so that's sort of circular, but that's fine. Okay. That's great. Okay, Mike, as we wrap up our conversation, is there anything we have not covered that you'd like to mention right now?
I just want to say how much I have enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Mike. And so how can people best find you online?
Well, you go to wineeconomist.com.
Yep.
Or write to me at mike@wineeconomist.com.
Okay. Are you on Twitter as well?
I'm on Twitter at Mike Veseth.
Excellent. Mike, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for all of the insider tips. There's just so many I'm going to take away and do myself, from, how much would I pay for this wine to look again at cork, the whole gamut. It's been very valuable. Thank you so much for all of your insights. Bye for now, Mike. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this chat with Mike Veseth. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, I admire how Mike makes wine economics accessible, even to the extent that he changed his first name to be more approachable to readers. 2, it's great how Mike structured his book after Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days, even down to starting just a few blocks away from where the character Phileas Fogg started, in London, England. 3, unlike many other products, even agricultural ones, wine has a unique planning cycle, given that vines don't mature for 7 years on average. That necessary long-term perspective is why there are so many family-run wineries. Number 4, Mike describes Beaujolais Nouveau as a Black Friday wine when vintners get the cash they need from the harvest. He also makes a great point that Chile, being known for value, is both a blessing and a curse. The latter because low prices aren't always associated with high quality, and that makes launching premium labels far more challenging. Number 5, I want to avoid the biggest mistake Mike says we make: mistaking price for quality when it comes to wine. It's fascinating that MRI studies show the brain lighting up for happiness when subjects are told that the wine is more expensive. And number 6, I'm definitely playing that game of how much would you pay for this wine with myself and others to get a greater appreciation of the value of different wines. If you like this episode, please tell a friend about it, especially one who's interested in the fascinating wine and value tips Mike shared. You'll find links to Mike's website, books, social media handles, the video version of this conversation, and how you can join me next week on Facebook Live in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/64. Finally, if you want to learn why red wine shouldn't always be your default pairing for many cheeses, join me in a free online video class at nataliemclean.com/class. You won't want to miss next week when we'll be chatting with Paul Maybray, who says the wine industry must adapt to social media and new technology or face digital Darwinism. Dun, dun, dun. Find out what that means and the implications for you as a wine drinker next Wednesday. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that tastes twice as expensive as it costs. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.